That should be fine. Thank you. Well, thank you to the organizers for having me here. I also want to take the opportunity. I just defended my PhD defense last week, and I want to thank all the people in this room that I cited in my defense. It's a rare honor to get to thank you all in person. I think almost everybody here was cited there. So this is a large community effort. I'm really excited to be presenting here. So I'm going to talk today about the modeling efforts and the gravitational wave parameter estimations and predictions that we're getting from the University of Tennessee and Oak Ridge National Lab group. So we learned about all this today, so it's just here as a brief refresher. I'm going to focus on, where's my laser? Okay. I see it on the screen, but not here. Well, I'm going to focus on the two middle panels. So the hydrodynamic instabilities that come in these neutrino-driven core collapse supernova events. I'm not going to talk about rotation and magnetic fields, but obviously, as we've been hearing, those are important. But for most of the cases where we have slowly rotating models, what I'm going to be talking about generally will hold. And obviously, just highlighting here, this staining accretion shock instability, that's something that's going to produce gravitational waves as we see. So I've just put a little picture in here to remind myself. So talking about UT and Oak Ridge, the results I'm talking about come from the Chimera simulation. So this is our current state-of-the-art simulation that we use. At the end of the talk, I'll talk about kind of the next generation, where we're heading now. But for right now, Chimera, for those of you that don't know, it's named after this mythological creature whose whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So you have 3 different heads. And likewise, for this simulation code, we have 3 different codes that we combine together that are greater than the sum of their parts, and just as terrifying as the monster when we combine them all together. So the first head of Chimera is a pseudo-Newtonian hydrodynamics code. And this solves for a Newtonian potential using a multipole expansion, and then we include a general relativistic correction on the monopole term. And then all the hydrodynamics are done in a Newtonian framework, and then we close the system with tabulated nuclear equations of state. The second head is a nuclear reaction network, and for Chimera, this ranges from a 14-species alpha chain network all the way up to this massive 160-species network that goes from helium to zinc and includes many, many isotopes. And then the final head is neutrino transport, and we currently use multi-group flux-limited diffusion. We're going to have talk about neutrino theory later in the week, so we might hear about this. But for now, I'll just say this is an angular decomposition of the Boltzmann equation, and we take the lowest moment and we close it with the next highest moment. So that's where that name comes from. And then multi-group means we're including multiple energies of neutrinos, because that affects how they move around. We work in the ray-by-ray plus approximation, which means we solve for a single ray in direction for neutrino transport, and then we'll have different rays along each angle. And the plus means that the neutrinos can move in each angular direction, can advect in that direction as they're evolving in time. And then perhaps the most important part, including state-of-the-art neutrino interactions, as many as we can, updating them as we can. This is a very high-level overview. The paper I cite at the bottom, we'll get into each of these things in as much detail as you want. But this is a high overview of the simulation code I'm going to be discussing the results of. And without further ado, the main part of this talk is going to be concerning 3-dimensional Chimera simulations. And this is what we call the D series for Chimera. And this involved 3 progenitor models that varied in stellar progenitor mass, so a 9.6, 15, and 25 solar mass progenitor. And I'll refer to them by their mass, but they also differed in progenitor metallicity. And as far as the setup of the simulation goes, There were just a couple of small differences between the models. For the least massive model, we have a lower number of radial cells. And in Chimera, these are adaptive radial cells, so they can change their width and location in order to make sure we're capturing smaller features throughout the simulation. But the two larger models had the same number of radial cells, and they all had the same angular resolution of 1 degree. Likewise, one last difference, the less massive star had a large nuclear network, and the two larger stars had a 17 species nuclear network. But aside from that, they're run in the same way. They include the same equation of state, LSBCK, that's Latimer's Westy, with a 220 mega electron volt incompressibility parameter, and then the BCK EOS at lower densities. The final thing I want to mention is just for this run, the grid that we simulated on was a yin-yang grid. And you can imagine like the faces of a baseball, they come together to make a sphere. And so this has numerical advantages, and it's part of what let us get this 1 degree resolution. And it also makes the solution, the actual solving all the equations, highly parallelizable. So just some background on the simulations here. And what I'm going to focus on is just the gravitational wave output more so than the explosion dynamics. So these are the gravitational wave strains for each of these models, D9.6 in the upper left, D15 in the upper right, and D25 at the bottom. You see the plus polarization in black, the cross polarization in red, and there are two viewing angles. So depending if we are viewing the explosion along the z-axis or along the x-axis. And so you can see there are a lot of factors here that can affect this gravitational wave signal. Each of these progenitors has a very different signal, but they also have a lot of things in common. So as we move forward, I'm going to talk specifically about the D15 model, but I'm going to highlight the features that are the same across these models, okay? Generally speaking, the specifics are going to be different, but they're going to exhibit these features together. So I like to look at this spectrogram feature that we've been seeing. This is the color axis that we like to use, and this is a logarithm of the power spectral density, but it's equal to the, or it's related to the square of the gravitational wave amplitude. So the more red we are on this plot, the higher the gravitational wave amplitude, and the more blue, the lower the gravitational wave amplitude. And I just love this plot. As we've already talked about, it contains the whole history of the core collapse supernova. I'll just give some highlights for this particular model. In the low frequency regime, this is below around 300 hertz. We have contributions from neutrino-driven turbulent convection. And we also have a signal from the SASE. So this beating pattern is right around 70 hertz. And for the D15 model, that's the characteristic frequency for SASE. And it exists as long as SASE exists. And then finally, in this low frequency realm, we have this deep red bar that, as we've discussed, is associated with the gravitational wave memory and the ramp up to memory. So this is the asymmetry of the explosion, producing really high amplitude, really low frequency gravitational waves. So my colleague, Coulter Richardson, is going to talk about the memory from the D series. I'm going to talk about this feature in the middle, which I refer to as the high frequency feature or the GF feature. We're currently figuring out which one we want to use, but it's the high frequency component of the signal. And as we've discussed, it has to do with these protoneutron star oscillations. And as the protoneutron star contracts, these oscillations naturally increase. So because this is tied to something that's deterministic, and because it's the strongest part of the signal outside of the ramp up to the memory, that's why we're really interested in this and why we're motivated to investigate this feature from a detectability standpoint, and then from extracting important physics beyond just getting a detection. So the rest of the talk, that's what I want to focus on, is that part of the feature. And for these three-dimensional models, to better understand this high-frequency feature, we did a study where we combined two different analysis techniques. The first one was briefly mentioned, where we decomposed the region into 5 different parts of the computational domain, and we investigated which part of the gravitational wave signal comes from each of these regions. So on the right is kind of a pictorial diagram of that. On the left, it's actually showing how these region definitions change with time. And on the color axis, that's the Brunt by Saya frequency. So where it's white and red, that's where you're unstable to Ledoux convection, or convection in general. And where you're blue is where you're stable to convection. So just to briefly say, the regions we have, the innermost region is spherically symmetric in Chimera for numerical reasons. We have investigated to make sure, but there's no gravitational wave generation because we force it to be spherically symmetric. We make sure that region is low enough below the convective region that it doesn't affect anything. And then the convective region is region 1. So this is where we have Ledoux convection from entropy and lepton gradients that are sustained on the order of seconds because the protoneutron star is emitting neutrinos throughout the entire explosion. Region 2 is what we call the convective overshoot layer. So it's stable to convection. If any matter moves into that region, the motion is damped. And then region 3 are the surface layers of the protoneutron star going out to the density contour that's 10 to the 11 grams per cubic centimeter. Region 4 is that net cooling region. And region 5 is everything else. So just to harp on this region 5 for just a moment, the reason we define it that way is for numerical considerations. As was mentioned, when you do this decomposition, you have to be very careful with how you calculate the gravitational wave strains. You end up calculating something that's like a surface term that cancels out when you do the total integration from the center of the star out to the edge. But in between each of these zones, it doesn't necessarily cancel out. So you have to be very, very careful. And because of the shock interface, that introduces numerical problems. So in order to avoid that, we just don't make that distinction, and we calculate all the way out to our computational domain. And what we get in the end is still the gravitational wave contribution from the net neutrino heating region. And the reason is because our progenitor is spherically symmetric. So as the matter is moving inward, it's not producing any gravitational waves until the shock passes through and introduces all these instabilities. So that's why we defined region 5 that way. And then again, on the left, you can see how these definitions change with time. So when we do this regional breakdown and calculate the gravitational wave strains, this is the plus polarization in regions 1 through 5. And if you add up those regions, you get the total strain down at the bottom. This is the same strain we saw previously. And we see a couple things immediately. First of all, in region 5, that is where the low frequency part of the signal is coming from. And the high frequency part is contained from everything below region 5. We also see that when the signal begins around 100 milliseconds after that quiescent period, it begins in regions 4 and 3, so outside of the protoneutron star, attributing this to accretion funnels hitting the surface of the protoneutron star and exciting those protoneutron star oscillations. They can excite oscillations that have an effect quite deep in the protoneutron star. We can see it moves into region 2. And during that same time, while Ledoux convection is happening, it's not strong enough yet to generate strong gravitational waves. So that's the initial part of the signal. And from around 250 milliseconds post-bounce to about 500 milliseconds post-bounce, that's where we have the maximum amplitude of the total signal. And you can see during that time that we have a significant contribution from regions 1 through 4. So each region is contributing significantly to the maximum signal. So this corresponds to the time where we have strong accretion onto the protoneutron star surface. But in our models, what we're seeing is that is not the sole contributor to the gravitational wave generation. And in fact, as the explosion gets underway, these accretion funnels are no longer able to reach the protoneutron star, and the amplitudes in regions 3 and 4 decrease, while the amplitudes in regions 1 and 2 remain strong from that Ledoux convection. And so we see that the excitation begins from outside the protoneutron star, then develops within the protoneutron star at the same time. Both of these processes are happening. And then the accretion onto the protoneutron star dies off, and this signal is driven by Ledoux convection deep within the protoneutron star. So this is the picture we start to see looking at the gravitational waves directly. Through another lens, but still looking at the gravitational waves directly. If we look at the luminosity of the gravitational waves, this is a slightly different calculation. We can't break it up by region, but we can calculate it out to a certain radius and compare it to the total luminosity. And what this is showing is that the majority of the luminosity is initially contained within region 3 and below, and then it gradually moves into region 2. So just another way of looking at the data that tells the same story. Initially in the outer part of the protoneutron star, and then gradually moving into the deeper part of the protoneutron star, being where the gravitational wave energy is focused, the luminosity. But as has been mentioned, we can also do this perturbative analysis, also called a modal analysis. So when you perturb your hydrodynamic equations, you end up solving for quasi-normal, non-radial, quadrupolar oscillation modes of the protoneutron star. Henceforth, I'll just call them modes, so oscillation modes. And particularly for Chimera, it's been demonstrated that if you have a pseudo-Newtonian code, if that's how it treats gravity, you need to work in a framework that is compatible with that pseudo-Newtonian code. So we perturb the Newtonian hydrodynamic equations. The equations we saw earlier were for a relativistic spacetime. And if you have a relativistic treatment of gravity, that's what you want to do. But for us, this is the correct approach. Otherwise, you can have differences on the order of tens of % for the frequencies that you calculate. But what we see here on the left, these are the oscillation mode frequencies and their evolution in time. And the different colors correspond to different mode labels. So just like we spoke about before, the kind of magenta and green colors are G modes, and then the blue color is an F mode. And so what we see is low order G modes initially describing this HFF feature very, very well. And then towards the end, the F mode describing this feature very, very well. And despite all the approximations in this modal analysis, it's very striking that these frequencies evolve smack dab in the middle of this high frequency feature. Beyond that, we can actually calculate the luminosity from each of these oscillation modes. And this luminosity we're able to calculate within each region. And so what I've plotted here on the right is the power emitted as gravitational waves from each oscillation mode. That's denoted by color. And the line type is showing the region that is producing that much gravitational wave power. And so there is kind of an elephant in the room. That big feature for the F mode at early times does not appear to be physical. So in the gravitational wave data, we do not see significant gravitational waves that line up with the blue part of the curve at early times. So this is likely due to some of the approximations in this method, but this is kind of the standard method that is used so far. So there is already, just looking at one room for improvement, we have an unexplained feature. But for the features that are very, very close to the high frequency feature, it explains things very well, and it matches with our previous description, where this G2 mode that's in magenta, when it is dominant, the highest gravitational wave power output is coming from region 3, which is the solid line. As we transition into the G mode, it's still dominated by region 3, and then gradually transitions into being dominated from region 2. And then as we transition into the F mode at late times, we see that there is several orders of magnitude of difference between the power emitted deep within the protoneutron star at regions 1 and 2 and the power emitted at region 3. I'll also mention the boundary condition point that was made by Bernard earlier is not missed. It is very important. And so for this simulation, our outer boundary was at the surface of the protoneutron star. And we investigated, and we see that if we extend that boundary out, the results no longer make sense like they do in this case. Likewise, some of the assumptions we make in the simulation necessitate that we confine ourselves to the protoneutron star. The assumptions no longer hold if we go outside the protoneutron star. So that's how we get these results. And I want to highlight in astroseismology, there's a well-known feature called an avoided crossing. That's where these mode frequencies, as they evolve in time, get very close together and then diverge. And so we have two of those between the G2 and G1 mode and the G1 and the F mode as we transition along to HFF. And the understanding for these avoided crossings is that the character of the oscillation is changing. So the two modes that are doing the avoided crossing, they exchange character at the avoided crossing, and then as they evolve with that changed character. And so what's interesting is that if we look at now, this is the radial amplitude of one of the eigenfunctions that you solve for. And on the left is before the avoided crossing, on the right is at the avoided crossing. And so we can see this in the behavior of this eigenfunction. The amplitude of the G2 mode is decreasing, while the magnitude of the amplitude of the G1 mode is increasing. And then after the avoided crossing, we see the behavior has switched, where we have a very, very low amplitude G2 mode and a very high amplitude G1 mode. And these times correspond precisely to when we have these transitions in the gravitational wave strains that we broke down by region. So around that 180 milliseconds is where we see significant contributions from within and without the protoneutron star. And that second avoided crossing from G1 to F is where we start to see more interior-dominated gravitational wave strains. So this is a second method that explains what we're seeing in gravitational waves quite well. So we had three different methods we looked at that kind of told the same story with the gravitational wave emission beginning predominantly from outside the protoneutron star and then gradually moving inward. And as we have said, why we care about this is because these different oscillation modes will have a different relationship with the protoneutron star. And so ultimately, we'd like to have some universal relation that can relate the mass and radius of the protoneutron star as a function of time to the frequency of this high frequency feature. And depending on what we're seeing, we're going to have a different relation. So the G mode should be proportional to some power of the surface gravity of the protoneutron star, m over r squared, and the F mode with the mean density. And so this is an example on the right of fitting these oscillation modes to the mean density or the surface gravity. And we're wanting to move towards looking at these relations ourselves and maybe seeing that we need to fit with a G mode early on and an F mode later, which has also been done by some other groups. That is going to be complicated from a detection standpoint, but the benefit would be if you can do both fits, then you can solve not just for the relationship between M and R, but actually the evolution of M and R individually. So a more difficult problem, but with some really, really interesting results if we're able to do it. I'll just very, very briefly mention this. We have a two-dimensional study where we investigated the effects of the nuclear equation of state on that high frequency feature. So we have the same model, the exact same physics going into our simulation. The only thing we changed was the equation of state. And if we look at this high frequency feature, we identify the points with the maximum power spectral densities. And calculate the slope, the question was, does that change with the nuclear equation of state? And more importantly, is it detectable? So another collaborator, Alejandro Casales Lagos, is going to talk a little bit about how this parameter estimation is done. But these are our results for this particular study. And the upshot was there is a difference between the nuclear equation of states. There's an observable difference in that high frequency feature. And moreover, it's in principle detectable. Okay. Now, in this case, we only varied one variable. So a lot more study needs to go into all the effects on the high frequency feature. But nonetheless, in principle, it remains detectable. So as promised, I just want to briefly show where the UT-ORNL group is heading towards. So the next generation code we're developing is called the Toolkit for High Order Neutrino Radiation Hydrodynamics, or TORNADO. This is an open source code that is being developed actively. Several people have worked on PhDs with it. Several papers have been published. But the link there will take you to the code in its current instantiation. One of the big things about this code is that it is all discontinuous Galerkin finite element method based. So instead of finite volume methods, it's finite element methods. And there are numerical practicalities for why that's useful and well motivated. So we're excited for that. It's also a fully general relativistic code with hydrodynamics, the conformally flat approximation for gravity solved that way, and including the next moment up in the neutrino transport. So M1 energy dependent neutrino transport. And everything is adaptive mesh refinement enabled. So very excited to move forward on this. We're also going to include magnetohydrodynamics. We have a current student working on that. And this will be the next generation. So still lots of things to come out of Chimera, but this is where we're heading, recognizing that there is still room for improvement. So I just want to conclude by saying, I think as we've all heard, we're now in the era of really high fidelity core collapse supernova simulations. And I think that we're now at the point where we can start to make sophisticated predictions using gravitational waves. I think the neutrino-driven mechanism has been robustly demonstrated, as we saw. And also this signal is being seen by every group, the general features that I was mentioning. And then with our methods, we sourced and characterized the gravitational wave emission, connecting it directly to regions of the core collapse supernova that have to do with the explosion mechanism, and ultimately getting to being able to do parameter estimation of the protoneutron star. So we've had a lot of breakthroughs in the last decade, and I think the next decade we're going to have a similar number of breakthroughs, and it's a very exciting time to be in this field of study. So with that, I will thank you all very much. These are the papers that I'm on that I cited, and then these are my other references. So thank you all so much.
Okay, we have time for a few quick questions before lunch. Yes.
Thank you for the very nice talk. So you mentioned that this is like the Chimera D series simulation. How does it differ from the C series?
One of the big differences is that yin-yang grid that allows for much greater angular resolution. That is the biggest difference. I think the physics is mostly the same aside from some updates to the neutrino interactions.
Can I ask a follow-up?
The C series had significant improvements in the treatment of the neutrino transport relative to the A and B, and the D series was yin-yang enabled with some other differences. The full specifications are in the Bruin et al. 2020 AppJ supplement article, which is about 100 pages. So.
One last quick question, or are we all hungry for lunch? Look, I maybe can get the last question. Are you sure that this F mode not overlapping so well at early times is a problem, or is it just that there's no driver there?
Yeah, so the problem is the not matching with the gravitational wave data. So one interpretation would be that things seem accurate when you're really close to the high frequency feature, and maybe not so accurate afterwards. So we had some other features of the G modes decreasing with frequency, which is a little bit odd. That's one interpretation. As far as so, I don't know that it's a huge problem, but it's an indication that there is room for improvement in that analysis for all the approximations that are made.
Let's end this. I'm the chair. Let's end the session and thank you.